She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned to her assistant and laughed. Sandra Anderson, CEO, corner office, caramel wool coat, had just sold a building for $1,000 to a man with grease under his fingernails and a worn jacket and no briefcase. She called him very optimistic. Her team laughed on cue. Then they climbed into their black SUV and drove away without looking back. What none of them did, not the structural engineer, not the real estate attorney, not Sandra herself, was pull back a single tarp. 8 tarps. Sitting right there in the dark, Ronald Sanchez waited until their taillights disappeared. Then he walked back inside with a flashlight and started pulling. Tarp 1. A car. Tarp 2. Another car. By tarp 6 his hand was shaking, because underneath tarp 6 was a 1971 De Tomaso Pantera, one of 10,000 ever built, that would sell at Barrett-Jackson 6 months later for $178,000. Sandra Anderson had sold him the whole building for $1,000, and she never once looked under the tarps. The morning Olivia asked if they were going to be okay, Ronald Sanchez had exactly $7 in his checking account. Not 700, not 70. 7. He'd checked his phone 3 times already, standing in the kitchen at 5:47 a.m., still in yesterday's clothes, because he'd fallen asleep at the table going over numbers that refused to cooperate no matter how many times he rearranged them. The coffee was burnt. The overhead light had been flickering for 2 weeks, and he hadn't fixed it. Because every time he thought about fixing it, he thought about how much a new ballast cost, and then he thought about something else entirely. Olivia padded in wearing her yellow socks, the ones with the rubber grip ducks on the bottom. She was 7 years old, and she had her grandmother Carol's eyes, sharp, patient, the kind that didn't miss things. And she looked at her father, standing at the kitchen counter staring at his phone like it had personally offended him. Her voice landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. "Are we going to be okay?" Ronald didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was complicated, because the dishonest answer was easy, because he was 31 years old, and a trained automotive engineer who had spent 7 years rebuilding engines that other people had given up on. And he was standing in a kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee with $7 to his name. And his daughter was looking at him with those Carol eyes and asking the one question he had been avoiding since 17 on a Friday night 6 months ago. He set the phone down, turned to face her, and he lied the way good fathers lie, not with words exactly, but with the steadiness of his voice, the specific angle of his shoulders, the way he kept his hands relaxed at his sides like nothing was on fire. "Yeah, baby, we're going to be okay." Olivia studied him for 3 more seconds, longer than most adults would. Then she nodded once, decisive, the matter apparently settled, and went to get her backpack. Ronald picked his phone back up, still $7. He put it in his pocket and started making her breakfast. The drive to school took 11 minutes on a good day and 14 when the light at Dexter and Davison caught them, which it did that morning, because of course it did. Olivia sat in the back seat, with her yellow duck socks now hidden inside her sneakers. Her backpack on her lap, even though she didn't need it there, the strap twisted around both wrists the way she did when she was thinking hard about something she hadn't said yet. Ronald watched her in the rearview mirror. She was processing what he'd told her. He could see it in the slight movement of her jaw, the way her eyes tracked something that wasn't in the car. She had gotten that from him, the habit of running a thing through twice before letting it leave your mouth. It had skipped a generation. Thomas Rodriguez, Ronald's father, said everything once and meant it completely. But it had landed intact in both Ronald and Olivia, this particular kind of careful thinking, and he had never decided whether to consider that a gift or a warning. Bo di do humne. She was trying her grandmother's Vietnamese and getting the tones slightly wrong, which she knew, which was part of why she liked doing it. The pronunciation drifted, but the intent arrived perfectly. Ronald kept his eyes on Dexter. Going to look at a building. What kind of building? Old one. Not sure yet. Olivia processed this with the full weight of a 7-year-old who had recently decided that adults were mostly just people who hadn't figured things out but were too proud to say so. Is it a good old? Or a bad old? Ronald thought about that for a beat longer than he probably should have. Don't know yet, that's what I'm going to find out. The school parking lot was crowded. He found a spot near the back. Olivia climbed out and stopped, which she always did, which meant something was coming. She turned around and looked at him through the open car door. If it's a good old, she said, perfectly serious, you should probably go inside it. Then she ran toward the entrance without looking back. Ronald sat in that parking lot for 63 seconds. He counted because counting gave his hands something to do. The number was arbitrary and exact, and both things mattered right now. Then, he put the car in reverse and drove east toward a neighborhood. He knew the way you know a place you've driven through 100 times without stopping from the outside, which is a completely different kind of knowing than from the inside. He was about to learn the difference. He had grown up on the west side, the Davison corridor. Third house from the end of a block that used to have 7 kids under 12 on it and now had 2, the rest having moved or grown or scattered in the ways that cities scatter people when the economics shift beneath them. His father, Thomas Rodriguez, had run a 1-bay garage on that same street for 22 years. The kind of operation built entirely on trust and reputation, and the specific skill of fixing things right the first time, so they didn't have to come back. Thomas had been quiet in the way that certain men are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned that saying less makes what you do say land harder. He spoke to Ronald about the work, not as instruction but as transmission, the way you pass something from one body to another, without necessarily naming what you're passing. By the time Ronald was 9, he was handing tools without being asked. By 12, he was diagnosing problems by sound alone. Standing outside the bay, with his eyes closed while Thomas brought an engine up, through its range, listening the way a doctor listens to a heart that is telling the truth about itself. By 17, he could walk into any shop, hear an engine idle for 40 seconds, and name 3 things wrong with it, before touching a single component. His mother Carol called it a gift. Thomas called it paying attention. He said it once, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had been gray for so long it had forgotten what color it started as. Everybody looks. Not everybody sees. Those are 2 different activities, and most people confuse them their whole lives. Ronald had been 15. He filed the sentence away in the part of his brain that stored things he didn't fully understand yet, but recognized were going to matter later. He understood it now with a precision that 15-year-old Ronald could not have accessed, because understanding it required having been on both sides of it. The side where you look and the side where you see, and the 7 years at Vantage Auto Holdings had put him on both sides in sequence. Vantage had been the right job for the right reasons. Technical restoration division. Work that required both engineering precision and hands-on instinct. The rare combination that most companies claimed to value and then systematically or failed to protect when money entered the conversation, with more persuasive arguments. Ronald had not been the loudest voice at Vantage. He had often been the most accurate one. Colleagues called him when something seemed impossible. Managers included his assessments in reports without always crediting the source. He had built the quiet reputation of the man you called when the job required both a degree and a decade of feel in your hands. Then the merger happened. Vantage Auto Holdings finalized the acquisition 8 months before the February morning that changes everything. The acquiring company had no interest in the technical restoration division, didn't fit the new financial model, didn't generate returns at the velocity the new ownership required, didn't photograph well on a restructuring slide. 14 people lost their jobs on a Friday night, their notifications delivered by email at 11:17 p.m. by someone who had almost certainly been advised by counsel to send it after business hours. Ronald read his on the kitchen table with Olivia asleep in the next room. The apartment so quiet he could hear the refrigerator cycling. He sat with the phone for a moment, then put it face down on the table. Sat in the dark for 20 minutes doing nothing in particular, not grieving and not planning. Just sitting with the fact of it, until the fact of it became something he could stand next to without it knocking him over. Then he went to bed. The next morning he started a list, not of grievances, not of people who had failed him, a list of what actually existed. $18,000 in savings, built over 7 years of living smaller than his income, no significant debt, an engineering degree and 2 decades of hands-on knowledge that belonged to him in a way no corporate restructuring could reach, a 7-year-old daughter who believed her father knew where he was going, and 8 months of impound yard work and careful living that had followed the layoff, 8 months of looking without knowing yet what he was looking for. Brian Thompson had found it first. Brian and Ronald had worked alongside each other at Vantage for 3 years. Brian ran fabrication and welding, big man, easy laugh, hands capable of precise work at a scale most people couldn't manage. They were different in the visible ways and identical in the ones that mattered. Both did things completely or not at all. Both had inherited their profession from someone who had done it before them. Brian from his uncle in Alabama, Ronald from Thomas on Davison, and both had ended up at Vantage for the same basic reason. They were genuinely exceptional at something real, and the company, for a window of time, had recognized it. After the layoffs, Brian freelanced. Fabrication, welding, engine work when it came through. He lived on the east side in a house he rented month to month and described with his characteristic simplicity as enough space to work, not enough to accumulate anything he didn't need. He kept himself mobile, not from fear, from intention. He had no children, no significant debt, and a personal philosophy that Ronald had come to think of as strategic simplicity dressed as casual living. A truck driver named Marcus, not someone Ronald knew, just a Marcus, the kind of coincidence Detroit produced with some regularity, mentioned to Brian, in passing, that a company called Cross Capital Group was trying to unload a garage structure they'd acquired as part of a larger land purchase. They wanted it gone fast and cheap. That was the entire information. Now he's Brian called Ronald that same night because something in the part of the brain that processes things, before you're consciously aware of processing them, said, "Pass this along." Ronald didn't say much on the phone. He took the address. He thanked Brian. He sat with it for a few hours. Then at 6:30 the following morning, he drove east. He parked across the street from the property and stayed in the car. The temperature was 18 degrees. Not the kind of cold that comes at you directly, but the kind that settles in, patient, the way certain problems settle, pervasive, even-handed, waiting for you to stand still long enough to feel the full extent of it. Thin snow moved sideways in a wind that came from somewhere northeast. The building sat at the rear corner of a larger parcel, fenced, gated, maybe 900 square feet from across the street, though it was hard to be precise at this distance. The roofline had a visible sag at the eastern corner. The roll-up door on the front face was warped at the top left in the specific way that indicated a mechanism that hadn't opened in years, not months. 2 of the 4 small windows on the east-facing wall were boarded with plywood that had been there long enough to turn the same gray as the concrete block around it. From the outside, it was objectively unimpressive. Ronald sat and looked at it for 15 minutes without moving. Not at what was visible. He was measuring the footprint from the roofline geometry, calculating interior clearance height, noting how the structure sat on the lot, the foundation depth inferable from the grade at the perimeter, the drainage pattern in the frozen soil along the east wall. He was looking at the address itself, this specific intersection, the street it sat on, what was 2 blocks north and directly east and 3 streets over. He had driven through this part of the city dozens of times. He had been watching this corridor the way his father used to watch an engine, before opening the hood, gathering information, before forming a conclusion, because a conclusion formed too early was just a guess wearing a confident face. He had a quiet suspicion about this neighborhood. Not loud enough to call a conviction yet. quiet and precise, and exactly the frequency at which the most reliable knowledge tends to operate. He called the number on the sign at the gate. Got an assistant at Cross Capital. Arranged a viewing for the following week. Then he drove back west. That evening, he called Timothy Clark. Timothy was a fellow engineering graduate who had gone into municipal planning rather than private sector, a choice Ronald hadn't understood at 22 and understood completely now. He worked in the city's planning office, mid-level, stable, the kind of position that accumulates information the way certain rooms accumulate warmth, slowly, and from sources most people aren't paying attention to. Ronald asked a neutral question. Carefully neutral, precisely worded, the development zone classifications for the northeast quadrant, specifically the block around this corridor and the secondary roads. Feeding it. Timothy gave him a neutral answer. The entire block sat inside what the city's internal planning documents classified as a Phase 2 commercial development priority zone. Infrastructure upgrades. Formally announced within 12 to 18 months. Land values in the zone would move when the announcement became public. The gap between what land in that corridor, currently priced at reflecting its present appearance, abandoned and unimproved, and what it would be worth once the announcement landed, was a gap that existed right now only in planning documents, and in the heads of the people who had read them. Ronald thanked Timothy and ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and started writing numbers. He wrote for a long time. By the time Carol arrived to drop off Olivia, she drove 40 minutes each way without being asked, because that was simply who Carol Lee was. Ronald had filled 2.5 pages with calculations and cross-references, and the specific kind of marginal notations that indicates a mind working through something larger than a single column can contain. Carol came through the door and looked at him the way she had looked at Thomas for 34 years, the sideways assessment of a woman who could read the temperature of a room from the sound of someone's breathing. You found something? Not a question. Ronald looked up. Maybe. I don't know yet. Carol set her purse on the counter and looked at the notebook pages without reading them. Thomas used to get that look. Sitting late, moving a pencil around, not saying much, a pause. He called it hearing the metal. Ronald didn't respond immediately. Olivia came in with the full constellation of urgent concerns that 7-year-olds generate without apparent effort: a snack, a missing sock, a pressing question about whether penguins had knees, and the moment with Carol closed the way those moments do. Cleanly, without ceremony, leaving something behind that lodged in the structure of what came next. Hearing the metal, he thought about it while he made Olivia her snack. He thought about it while he put her to bed. He thought about it at the kitchen table at 1:47 a.m., when he finally closed the notebook and put it in his jacket pocket. Tomorrow, he would go look at a garage. The viewing was scheduled for 10 on a Thursday. Ronald arrived at 9:53. He stood at the gate and looked at the building again, closer, now, detail level. The corrugated tin roof was rusted at the seams and around the vents. The concrete block walls were intact, no visible bowing, no catastrophic foundation, cracking, he could detect, from the perimeter, which told him something the listing had not communicated and the agent had not mentioned. Sandra Anderson arrived at 10:12, black SUV, professional driver. The door opened before the vehicle fully stopped, which was a specific kind of statement. The statement of someone who has decided that waiting for complete stillness is a form operance they have chosen not to practice. She was 38 years old and what Ronald would later come to think of as a particular American type. The inheritor who had worked hard enough that the inheritance could no longer fully explain the result. She had taken Cross Capital Group from mid-sized residential operation to a commercial development firm with significant positions across 3 states. And she had done it through a combination of financial intelligence, territorial aggression, and the specific kind of confidence that eventually stops registering contradictory information. Because it has decided that contradiction is a malfunction in the source rather than a signal worth processing. caramel-colored wool coat, heeled boots on frozen ground, no hesitation. Her assistant Angela Young walked a half step behind, with a clipboard and the expression of someone who had learned to read her employer's moods from posture rather than face. Behind Angela, a structural engineer from a contracted firm, his own clipboard, a real estate attorney in a coat that cost more than Ronald's car payment. Sandra looked at the building first, then at Ronald 3 seconds. The assessment was not mean. It was something more efficient than mean, the kind that processes available visual data and returns a conclusion before the conscious mind has had a chance to intervene. Work jacket, worn at the right shoulder, 2 years old at minimum. Hands that showed their history. No associate, no clipboard, no briefcase. Are you a mechanic or do you do salvage work? Her voice carried perfectly in the cold. Light, almost conversational. The kind of question that sounds neutral until Angela was already smiling before Sandra finished asking it. Ronald looked at the building. Can we go inside? Sandra paused, one beat, not a hesitation, just enough to register that he hadn't answered, then turned to the side entrance. The roll-up door had been non-functional for 3 years. She mentioned this as she unlocked the pedestrian door, not as an apology, but as a disclosure, the way you disclose a known defect you've already priced in. She gestured for him to go ahead, followed with her team. Inside was genuinely dark. The boarded windows blocked most ambient light, and the electrical system Sandra's technician had condemned before the listing offered nothing. Ronald used his phone's flashlight and moved into the space, letting it establish itself around him before he started reading it. The ceiling height was better than the exterior roofline, had implied maybe 14 feet at the ridge. The concrete floor was poured in sections with visible crack lines at the joints, but no heaving, no differential settlement he could detect in the sweep of the flashlight along the slab edge. The foundation coursing at the wall base was intact where he could examine it. Sandra narrated the defects like a recital. Roll-up door, jammed 3 years, mechanism seized, full replacement required. Ceiling joists, 3 visible structural cracks, marked with orange spray paint from a prior engineering visit. Electrical, fully condemned. Foundation. Possible settling in the northwest quadrant, flagged in the site report. Estimated demolition and clearance, $12,000 to $15,000. Net value of the structure accounting for those costs. Negative $15,000, stated flatly, without softening, the way you state arithmetic you expect to be received without argument. Ronald moved his flashlight slowly, wall to wall, corner to corner. He ran his hand along the concrete a block at shoulder height, feeling for the temperature differential that indicated moisture infiltration, the texture that indicated a correct original mix, the absence of crumbling at the mortar joints that indicated structural integrity the surface appearance didn't undermine. And he moved the flashlight across the floor, across the 8 shapes covered in tarps. 8 of them. Different sizes, arranged in 2 rough rows, covered with heavy-duty blue tarps, not the cheap kind, the kind someone had chosen deliberately layered and tied with rope and coated with years of accumulated dust, and the particular grime that settles in a sealed, unventilated space over decades of non-use. The structural engineer's notes from his prior visit were apparently about ceiling joists and foundation corners. He had not pulled a tarp. He had not been contracted to pull tarps. He had been contracted to assess structural elements, and he had assessed structural elements, and the 8 shapes on the floor had remained under their covers, patient and invisible in plain sight, because nobody in Sandra Anderson's professional orbit had thought to ask what was underneath them. Not because they were careless exactly, because the question had never been necessary before. Because in their framework, the building was the point and the contents were incidental. And because a person who has already decided what a thing is worth rarely investigates the alternative. Sandra's eyes passed over the tarps once. Storage debris. Previous tenant left it. Cleared as part of our demo plan. Ronald said nothing. He moved to the northeast corner and let his flashlight rest there a moment longer than the other corners. The top in this corner was larger than the others. The shape beneath it rose from the floor to somewhere approaching the ceiling height, and the silhouette of it, in the yellow beam, was a shape he had encountered enough times in enough contexts that his body registered it before his conscious mind confirmed it. The specific low-slung profile, the greenhouse angle, the proportions of something that had been built to move through air rather than simply across ground. He kept the flashlight moving. Wall, joist, foundation edge. He spent 12 minutes inside. Then he walked back out into the cold and asked one question. How much? Sandra looked at him, the 3-second assessment again. Then she turned to Angela as if demonstrating something for the group, her voice carrying to all of them, $1,000, a beat, full liability waiver, no representations. And there's a relocation clause you'd need to vacate within 18 months if the broader development project receives formal approval and breaks ground. We'd need written confirmation you understand that before signing. Ronald said he understood. He said he'd take it. Sandra held the look for just a moment longer than the moment required, waiting for the negotiation. The counteroffer, the request for an extended timeline on the relocation clause, the demand for some concession that would indicate. He understood the calculus of the transaction, but he just stood there in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at her with the specific stillness of someone who has already done the math and finds the current number uninteresting as a site of dispute. The contract was signed at a folding table near the gate. Angela produced it from a portfolio. The attorney positioned himself at Ronald's shoulder. The wind came across the lot in a flat gust that made the paperwork want to leave. Ronald signed where indicated. 3 places Sandra signed for cross capital. The key transferred brass, old, actual weight to it. The kind of key made when keys were still made to last. Sandra turned toward the SUV and said something to Angela that wasn't loud but wasn't private either. Something about the file notation, about a very optimistic man. Angela's laugh was brief and light. The structural engineer was already looking at his phone. The attorney was already walking. Ronald stood at the gate after they drove away. Then he turned and walked the perimeter of the building one more time. Slowly. He had the key. He was not in a hurry. He stopped near the side door. Through the gap in the warped doorframe, the frame had shifted enough over the years that the door didn't quite seal at the top left. There was a diagonal slice of interior visible. Dark. And in the far reach of that diagonal, the large tarp, the tall one, the one in the northeast corner, whose silhouette had registered in his body before his mind caught up. The shape that was not debris. The shape that was something else entirely. He stood there for exactly 2 seconds. Then he walked to his car and drove home. He didn't call Brian that night. He didn't call Carol. He didn't call anyone. He made dinner pasta, simple, the kind of meal that keeps hands busy while the mind runs its own separate operation. And sat with Olivia while she told him about the cloud debate. Her class had apparently spent a significant portion of the afternoon arguing about whether clouds were alive, a question that had generated more heat than the teacher had anticipated. And Olivia had taken the position that clouds were definitely not alive, but possibly had feelings, which she defended with a logical structure that was imprecise, but not entirely without foundation. Ronald told her he found the position genuinely interesting. He meant it. After Olivia was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the notebook and the specific silence that a small apartment produces at 10:30 on a winter night, when the person you're responsible for is asleep and the thing you're working through is large enough that saying it out loud right now would somehow make it less rather than more certain. He needed to hold it inside the calculation for one more night before he spoke it into the world and let other people's reactions begin to shape it. He wrote numbers, the square footage of the space, from his estimation, the ceiling height, the condition of the foundation relative to what a structural engineer retained to find problems had found, which was notable for what it had not included. No condemnation-level findings, no catastrophic structural failure, just the age-normal deterioration of a building that had been closed rather than destroyed. The address, the zone classification, The 12 to 18-month window Timothy had described in the neutral tone of someone relaying information they assumed was already known. And the tarps. The 8 shapes. What he believed he had seen in the northeast corner, and what he understood the shape of it to mean. Dobais, he wrote the number 400,000 and then wrote 600,000 next to it and looked at both of them for a while. Then he wrote 1,000 below both, circled it, drew a line connecting it to the range above. The difference between what you paid and what something was worth was not always visible from the outside. He had known that since he was 9 years old in Thomas's shop on Davison, learning that the car in the worst condition was not always the car with the least value, that sometimes the worst condition was simply what happened when something valuable got left alone long enough without someone who could see it correctly. He took the old notebook out of his jacket pocket, not the spiral one for vehicle records. Thomas's notebook water-stained at the corner, the cover soft from years of pocket living, the pages dense with 30 years of a man's observations, written in the specific shorthand of someone who never expected anyone else to need to read them. On a page near the middle, in Thomas's blunt, vertical handwriting. When they see rust, you see what's underneath. Ronald had read that sentence perhaps 100 times across his life. At 9, it had sounded like a mechanic's proverb. At 31, after 7 years inside a company that had rewarded looking without ever fully rewarding seeing, it sounded like the most economically precise thing anyone had ever written down. He took a pen and wrote below his father's line, in his own handwriting, which was smaller and angled slightly right, 1000, February. Olivia's watching. This is where it starts. He closed the notebook and put it back in his pocket, set the alarm for 5:30. Went to sleep. He was at the garage at 6 the next morning, heavy flashlight, pry bar, full toolkit, the spiral notebook for vehicle records, a roll of paper towels, and the key, which had been in his jacket pocket all night, and had been, in some way he couldn't have explained, a specific physical weight that kept him grounded through the hours of calculation and silence. The key was real. Everything else was still a number. The roll-up door was non-functional. He went through the side entrance. He stood in the middle of the floor for a moment with the flashlight off. Let his eyes adjust to what came through the unboarded windows. Let the space settle around him the way his father had taught him to let a shop settle, before starting work, not performing patience, actually practicing it, which is a different thing with different physiological results. Then he turned on the flashlight and went to the first tarp, the way you open something you are fairly certain is valuable, but cannot afford to be wrong about. Slowly, deliberately, without rushing toward the moment you want to get to, he untied the rope, set it aside rather than dropping it, gripped the tarp at the leading edge with both hands, pulled underneath. A car. He didn't react. He moved to the second tarp, untied the rope, pulled. Underneath. Another car. He worked through all 8 in 27 minutes, moving at the exact edge of control, fast enough to make progress, slow enough not to disturb anything unnecessarily, hands steady, because unsteady hands were a liability in this specific moment. 8 automobiles. 2 rough rows, all covered and left in a building that Sandra Anderson's entire professional team had entered, examined, and classified as an empty demolition target without once pulling a single tarp. He stood in the middle of them with the flashlight and said nothing out loud. The first car. He cleared dust from the badge with his sleeve. 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback. He opened the driver's door, the hinge protested but moved, and looked at the odometer. The reading was consistent with a vehicle that had not moved in decades. He checked the VIN plate. Original stampings, unaltered. He lifted the hood. V8 block, complete, no catastrophic damage visible. Head covers intact, carburetor present, intake components accounted for. He ran the flashlight slowly across the engine bay and wrote 4 numbers in the spiral notebook. The second car stopped him more substantially. He recognized the trim configuration before he cleared the badge, the specific combination of body stripe and panel geometry. His flashlight confirmed the badge, 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. A production variant so limited in number that its mere existence in recoverable condition was a significant data point. He had seen one before once, at a private collection showing in Bloomfield Hills while still at Vantage. The owner had offered a number that had made other people in the room exhale. This one was in better condition than that one. He found the frame number, readable, Rally Sport trim intact. He wrote the number in the notebook and drew a small circle around it, a habit from Vantage, where circled items were the ones that required special attention, the ones you couldn't afford to lose in the general information flow. Cars 3 through 5 were American sedans from the decade of Thomas Rodriguez's childhood, a 1958 Bel Air, a 1961 Galaxy, a 1963 Riviera, all recoverable, all worth real money after correct restoration, not the category his father had operated in from a one-bay shop on Davison, but a category Ronald had learned thoroughly at Vantage. Car 6 stopped him completely. He crouched at the front quarter panel. The badge was positioned at an angle that required a specific body position to read correctly. He held the flashlight from below and read it once. Then he stood, repositioned and crouched again from a different angle to confirm 1971 de Tommaso Pantera, Italian-American sports car. Mid-engine layout. Ford Cleveland V8 set in a body designed by an Italian coach builder, produced through a limited partnership, total worldwide production, across all years approximately 10,000 units. Finding one in any condition was unusual. Finding one sealed in a garage in Northeast Detroit with the chassis intact and the mid-engine compartment closed rather than compromised. That was the kind of thing that happened in stories. Except this was not a story yet. This was still a cold building on a February morning with a flashlight beam moving through it, and a man in a work jacket writing numbers in a notebook with a hand that was not entirely steady. The last two cars were beyond meaningful restoration. Floor pans collapsed. Body panels corroded through, but both held usable components. And components had their own market value, their own sourcing networks, their own category of buyers who knew exactly what they were looking for. He wrote it all down. Then he sat on an overturned milk crate near the north wall and did the math. Conservative restoration cost estimates for the Mustang and the Camaro, drawn from job records he had managed at Vantage. Major component acquisition costs, labor hours. The Pantera was a different calculation, entirely Italian-American, exotic, limited production, specialized knowledge required for correct restoration. But he had worked on one at Vantage, and he knew what the work demanded, and he knew what the result produced in the right room. The range, written in the spiral notebook on the milk crate in the cold, $400,000 conservative. $600,000 if the Pantera came together correctly and the market held. He had paid $1,000 for the building and everything inside it. He sat with that ratio for a long moment, not celebrating, not calculating the next move yet, just sitting with the specific weight of a thing that turns out to be exactly what you thought it was before you could prove it. The peculiar confirmation of a bet, made not on evidence but on the quality of your own vision, which is the most uncertain bet available, and the only one that produces this particular feeling when it resolves correctly. He thought about the $7 in January. He thought about Olivia's duck socks and the school parking lot and the 63 seconds of counting, while deciding what the word yes was actually made of, and whether he had the right to say it. He thought about his father at the workbench on Davison, shop rag in one hand, watching an engine the way you watch something that has something to tell you, if you can get quiet enough to hear it. Ronald stood up from the milk crate, walked to the northeast corner, put his hand flat against the concrete block wall, cold, solid, the specific solidity of something built correctly and then left alone, which was not the same as something built correctly and used, but it was a foundation. And foundations were the beginning of everything. He stood there for a moment, then he turned and walked toward the door. There was a significant amount of work to do, and he was already 11 minutes behind where he wanted to be. The phone rang at 8:14 on a Monday morning, 3 days after Ronald signed the contract. He was on the creeper board under the Mustang's front end, or where the Mustang's front end would eventually be accessible. Once he finished the preliminary structural assessment, which required lying on cold concrete with a flashlight at an angle that made his neck ache and his shoulders burn, and produced the kind of discomfort that only makes sense when what you're looking for is worth the finding. He had been at the garage since 5:50. He had not eaten anything. The coffee in the thermos near the north wall had gone cold an hour ago, and he had not noticed until just now. He looked at the screen before answering. Number he didn't recognize. Chicago area code. He answered anyway, because when you have $1.200 remaining in a bank account that started the month at 18,000 and a garage full of inventory that has not yet generated a single dollar, you answer numbers you don't recognize. You answer them and you keep your voice level, and you listen carefully to what is actually being said underneath what is being said. The voice on the other end was measured. Professional. The specific register of a lawyer who has been asked to make a call that isn't entirely comfortable and has decided to perform comfort as a management strategy. He introduced himself as representing Cross Capital Group. He hoped Ronald was settling in well with the property. He wanted to have a brief conversation about the scope of the recent asset transfer. Ronald sat up on the creeper board. The lawyer explained, with the careful unhurriedness of someone who bills by the hour and knows it, that the purchase agreement had been executed with some ambiguity regarding the classification of certain contents. Specifically, the agreement referenced the structure and its contents. But there was a legal question, not necessarily a hostile one. He was very clear about that. About whether items stored within the property might be better characterized as separate personal property, rather than fixtures or permanent contents of the structure itself. And if that characterization were to apply, then the scope of what had transferred for $1,000 would be potentially, meaningfully different from what Ronald might currently be assuming. Ronald did not respond immediately, because he had been expecting something like this. Not this exact shape, not this precise timing, but something. When the number paid is small enough, and the gap between what was paid and what exists is large enough, the people responsible for that gap begin looking for the edge of the contract. That was not unusual behavior. That was just how certain kinds of money operated when it became aware that it had made an error. It went looking for a technicality rather than an acknowledgement. But he had read the contract 3 times. Before signing and twice after, he thanked the lawyer for the call and said he would be in touch. He ended the call, set the phone on the concrete beside the creeper board, and looked at the flashlight lying next to it. Then he called Jeffrey Lewis. Jeffrey was 35. Contract law. Small firm in Midtown Detroit, with 6 attorneys and a waiting room that smelled like carpet cleaner, and ambition in approximately equal measure. Ronald knew him through a mechanic named Dwight, who knew Jeffrey from a church on the east side. They had both attended at different points in their lives. The connection was indirect enough that Ronald would not have called it a relationship before this morning. He would call it something more than that by the end of the week. Jeffrey called back in 40 minutes. He had clearly read the purchase agreement more than once before returning the call, because he didn't ask Ronald to describe it. He described it back, section by section, with the specific fluency of someone who has already identified the relevant provisions and is now confirming his reading against the person who lived the transaction. Then, the contract says structure and all contents. All is a complete word. It doesn't require enumeration, and it doesn't permit exceptions they failed to carve out explicitly. They didn't carve out anything. They signed it as written. Ronald exhaled slowly. That said, Jeffrey's voice remained level, not reassuring, just accurate. I would start working immediately if you haven't already. Document everything from today forward. Photographs with timestamps. A written log of every action taken on every item in that building. Don't publicize what you've found until you're further into the process. Not because you're wrong. Because when the number gets large enough, People stop arguing about the contract and start arguing about everything adjacent to it. Get ahead of the adjacent, Ronald thanked him, ended the call, and picked up the flashlight. He started documenting at 9:17 that morning. 4 photographs of each vehicle from 4 angles minimum, VIN plates, frame numbers, badge close-ups, overall condition shots, with the flashlight positioned to minimize shadow. He created a written log in the spiral notebook, date, time, condition summary for each vehicle. Specific notes on what had been disturbed and what had been left in place. Systematic, the same method Thomas had used for service records on Davison. Not because anyone required it, but because the record was its own form of ownership, and ownership needed to be established in every available medium simultaneously. He called Brian the following morning, early. Before Olivia was awake at Carol's house, he said there was no salary, no guaranteed timeline, no certain outcome. He said, "I found something real, Brian. I need someone who can work and who I can trust, and I don't have room for anything else right now." Brian was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much did you pay for the building?" Ronald told him. Another moment. "Say that number again." Ronald said it again. Brian Thompson laughed. Not the easy performance laugh Ronald knew from Vantage break rooms. Something smaller and more genuine, the laugh of a man recognizing that a real thing is actually happening in real time, and that recognition produces a specific involuntary sound. "I'll be there by 8, Brian said. "And I'm bringing breakfast because I know you haven't eaten." He was right on both counts. And he did. Brian arrived at 8:03 with 2 coffees and a paper bag from a place on Mac that did egg sandwiches, the way egg sandwiches were supposed to be done, real eggs. Bread toasted hard enough to hold, enough hot sauce available to constitute a genuine option rather than a courtesy gesture. He set everything on the workbench without ceremony, turned on the flashlight he'd brought because he'd assumed there would be no working electricity, and walked into the garage. He stopped, looked at the cars. Partially uncovered now from the documentation work Ronald had done over the previous 2 days. Each vehicle exposed enough to read its identity without fully disturbing the storage arrangement. Brian moved the flashlight from the Mustang to the Camaro, then walked slowly to the northeast corner and stood in front of the Pantera for a duration that Ronald, watching from the side door, timed at 45 seconds. Then Brian sat down on the concrete floor. Just sat where he was standing. Ronald waited. Brian looked up. His voice came at about half its normal volume. "Ronald, tell me the number you're thinking." Ronald told him the range. Conservative to optimistic. Brian set the paper bag down on the concrete beside him very deliberately. Like he was setting something fragile down and wanted to be sure it landed correctly. "And you paid 1,000. I paid 1,000. Brian nodded slowly. The nod of a man doing arithmetic in real time and arriving at a number that requires a moment to absorb. Then he stood up, picked up the paper bag, walked to the workbench, set down the coffee, and said, "Mustang first. Where do you want to start?" That was the entire conversation. Because some things you either understand or you don't, and no amount of additional language changes the category. Brian Thompson had been working with his hands long enough to know the difference between a thing that looked broken and a thing that actually was, and every car in that garage was the former, not the latter. And that distinction, for a man one's particular skill set, was not an abstraction. It was a job description. The work that followed did not photograph well and did not make for easy storytelling. That was the truth of it. The first 2 months were the kind of work that produces no dramatic moments and no scenes worth replaying in highlight. Just repetition. Cold. The specific grinding accumulation of progress, measured in millimeters and hours, rather than in moments anyone would choose. Ronald started sleeping in the garage during the first 3 weeks. Not because he wanted to, because the math required it. The apartment rent was $950 a month. If he wasn't sleeping there, he didn't need to heat it to a livable temperature. He could run the space heater in the garage and call that his utility cost instead. He told Carol it was because he wanted an early start each morning, which was true in the way that things can be true without being the complete truth, which is a category of statement that parents recognize immediately and choose not to pursue when they understand that pursuit would not serve anyone. He set the cot against the south wall, where the concrete block provided some buffer against the wind that came through the warped doorframe at night. He brought a sleeping bag rated to 10 degrees, which was optimistic for February in Detroit, but manageable if he kept the small space heater running on low and didn't move around too much after midnight, which he generally didn't because after midnight he was either working or unconscious with no reliable middle state. Olivia called every evening at 7:30. Without exception. Carol would dial and hand her the phone, and Olivia would ask the same question with minor variations. What did you fix today? What does it sound like when it's fixed? Is the red one fixed yet? The red one was the Pantera, which she had seen in a photograph Ronald had sent to Carol's phone, and which had apparently made a lasting impression in the specific way that beautiful objects make impressions on children who haven't yet learned to manage their own aesthetic responses. Ronald always told her specifically what had happened that day. He named parts. He described problems and what was being done about them. She understood almost none of the technical content and absorbed all of the emotional content, which was the actual information being transmitted. I am doing something real. I am making progress. I know what I am doing and I am doing it. The calls were not primarily about cars. They were about the daily confirmation that the man who had told her yes on a Tuesday morning in January was continuing to earn the right to have said it. The Mustang required a crankshaft replacement. The original was beyond reconditioning. The journals had worn unevenly in a pattern consistent with extended storage in a position that allowed lubricant to drain from the lower bearing surfaces, and the resulting micro-damage was not something a machine shop could address without risking structural integrity of the shaft itself. Ronald sourced a period-correct replacement through a private supplier in Chesterfield, Ohio, a man named Wyatt, who specialized in NOS and quality rebuilt components for pre-1970 American muscle, and whose website appeared to have been designed in 2004 and not updated since, which Ronald chose to interpret as evidence of someone who had found their market and didn't need to perform for it. 3-week wait on the crankshaft. During those 3 weeks, they shifted to the Camaro and the Bel Air, cleaning, cataloging, assessing what could be rebuilt versus what needed replacement, documenting everything in the parallel notebooks, Ronald's spiral record and Brian's own notebook, which Brian had started keeping without being asked. Documenting not just what they did but how and why, the specific decision logic behind each restoration choice. Ronald noticed this the first time Brian left the notebook open on the workbench, and he could see the level of detail inside it. He didn't say anything about it directly, but the noticing registered as the moment he understood that Brian Thompson had already moved past the question of whether this was going to work, and was now living inside the assumption that it would. That kind of confidence from someone with relevant expertise is not a small thing to carry. It functions as ballast. It keeps the calculation from capsizing when the arithmetic gets genuinely frightening. And the arithmetic got genuinely frightening. At the end of week 3, Ronald sat down with both notebooks and ran the numbers the honest way. Parts ordered and received, $4,200. Consumables, chemicals, abrasives, solvents, welding rod, shop supplies in the quantities that serious restoration work required, $2,800. The cotton space heater, classified as capital expenditures because he needed a category for them, $340. The impound yard work he'd been picking up 2 nights a week to generate operating cash, adding roughly $600 per week to partially offset the burn rate, remaining savings after all of it. $200. He looked at that number in the notebook for a long time. He looked at it the way you look at something that is simply what it is and requires no editorial response. Just accurate recognition. Then he closed the notebook and went back to the Camaro's cylinder head, which needed cleaning that could be done tonight with what was already on the shelf. He did not tell Brian about the $200, because Brian had taken this job without salary and without guarantee on faith and a handshake, and was putting in 12-hour days on the strength of what he'd seen and what he understood about what he'd seen, and adding the information that the operating cushion had compressed to something that wouldn't cover 4 weeks of parts costs was information that would not make Brian work better. It would only give him something to carry in addition to the work. Ronald carried it alone and kept moving, which was not heroism. It was just the only available option that preserved forward momentum. The roof went at 2:00 a.m. on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of February. A section of the corrugated tin at the east ridge, the same section with the visible sag Ronald had noted during the initial observation from across the street, gave way under the accumulated weight of ice from a freeze-thaw cycle that had been building for a week, maybe 4 square feet of material. A clean failure at a rusted seam rather than a structural collapse of the kind that would have required evacuation of the building and a complete reassessment of the project. But it was positioned directly above the Camaro, which they had fully disassembled for inspection. Engine pulled and staged on the stand, cylinder heads removed and on the bench, intake manifold on a clean rag, the block open and exposed in the specific way that made the 2 gallons of rainwater that came through in the next 40 minutes a problem of a very particular kind. Water in the cylinder bores, water in the lifter valley, water collecting at the low points of the crankcase where it would begin doing work against the metal. The moment the temperature dropped again before morning, Brian had been in the camp chair in the corner, asleep at some point after midnight, and the sound of the roof section failing woke him in under 3 seconds. He was on his feet and oriented before Ronald, who had been at the workbench and had heard it in real time, had moved to assess the damage. Brian looked at the water moving across the engine bay. He said several things accurately and at appropriate volume. Ronald looked at the water pooling in the cylinder bore openings. He traced the path it was taking. He calculated how much damage was accumulating versus how much would accumulate in the next 15 minutes if they acted immediately versus the next hour if they didn't. He found 2 tops. He covered everything, starting with the block and working outward to the staged components. He tucked the edges correctly tight at the corners, sealed against the bench surface, weighted with whatever was at hand. Then, he got the shop rags and started addressing the water that had already reached where it shouldn't. Brian watched him for 60 seconds. Then Brian picked up his tools and went back to the wiring harness assessment he'd been working on before he fell asleep. Neither of them said anything about what had just happened, because there was nothing useful to say about it. The roof had failed. The water had come in. The response was to address it and continue. Discussing it at length was a form of processing that neither of them had the reserves for right now, and they both understood this without negotiating it. Ronald repaired the roof section the following weekend using material from a supply yard on the east side, and 4 hours on a ladder in 23-degree weather. Brian held the ladder and passed material up, and did not offer opinions on whether this was the ideal use of a Saturday, which was one of the things about Brian Thompson that Ronald had come to rely on most. The man understood the difference between the time to talk and the time to work, and he had never once confused them. The call from Rachel Flores came on a Thursday evening near the end of February. Ronald was at the workbench. The overhead light new, wired correctly by Brian over a single weekend using skills inherited from an uncle in Alabama who had held an electrician's card for 30 years, was bright enough now to work by without the flashlight, which was a change that seemed small and was not small at all. He had been in this building for 3 weeks at that point, and the overhead light was the first life improvement that made the space feel like something being built rather than something being survived. Survived. He looked at the screen. Rachel's number hadn't changed. He answered. Rachel had heard something through Dwight, who had heard something from Carol, who had apparently conveyed the general fact of Ronald's current situation without conveying the specific shape of it, which was consistent with how Carol operated. She shared what was necessary and held the rest, and what she had apparently decided was necessary was that Rachel know Ronald was sleeping in a building on the east side and working on something she couldn't quite describe. Rachel had interpreted this through the most alarming framework available, which was reasonable given the gap between what she knew about Ronald's financial situation when she'd left Detroit 3 years ago, and what sleeping in a commercial building suggested about how much had changed since then. I heard you were living in a garage. Direct. No preamble. This was Rachel's way she arrived at the thing she wanted to say without the corridor of social preparation that most conversations used. It was something Ronald had always respected and occasionally found difficult. I'm working in a garage, Ronald said. There's a difference, is there? I'm also sleeping there temporarily, but that's a choice, not a circumstance. A pause. Is Olivia okay? Olivia's great. She's at my mother's, doing well in school. She's good. The pause that followed had content in it, the specific density of a silence that contained something being decided about whether to say it. Are you okay? And here was the thing about Rachel Flores that Ronald had never entirely resolved, even after 3 years and the silence that had followed her leaving. She asked questions she actually meant. That was not as common as it should be. She had left and she had her reasons, and they were her reasons to have, and he was not at this distance in any position to argue with them. But she had always meant her questions, and she was meaning this one. Yeah, he said. I'm working on something. Dwight said you bought a building. For $1,000. The pause recalibrated itself. $1,000. For the structure and the contents. What contents? He almost told her. The words were right there, fully formed, the entire inventory from the Mustang to the Pantera available to be spoken. But something stopped him, not protectiveness exactly, not strategy. Something closer to the superstition that certain things become more fragile. The moment you say them to the wrong person at the wrong moment, and he didn't know yet which category this moment was in. Some old cars, he said. Another pause. Then Rachel said something he was not expecting. I hope it works out. I mean it. You always knew what you were looking at when you were looking at something. He didn't respond immediately. Tell Olivia I think about her. Her voice was quieter. Not sad, exactly. Just the particular honesty of someone who has made a decision they continue to stand behind and continues to feel the weight of it at the same time. I will. He set the phone down on the workbench, stood it in the new overhead light for a moment. In the garage that was slowly becoming something different from what it had been, on the February morning he'd first unlocked the side door. Then he picked up the tool he'd set down to answer the call and went back to work. The crankshaft arrived from Ohio on a Wednesday morning, at the end of February, packed in a wooden crate that was considerably tenadefully more substantial than strictly necessary, Wyatt's standard approach. Apparently, on the theory that everything worth shipping was worth shipping as if it were irreplaceable. Because sometimes it was Ronald and Brian worked the installation over 2 days. Precise work, the kind that required both of them operating at their actual skill level, rather than the competent approximation of it. Brian's hands were better for the heavy torque sequences. Ronald's eye was better for the clearance measurements. They had established this division early and stopped negotiating it, which accelerated everything because they were no longer spending energy on the question of who did what, and could spend that energy on doing it. By Saturday morning, the Mustang was closer to finished than not, and Brian had started keeping his parallel notebook with a level of detail that Ronald noticed more specifically one Wednesday afternoon, when Brian left it open on the workbench to reference something. And Ronald could see what was inside, not just what they had done, but how they had decided to do it, the sourcing rationale, the restoration methodology choices and their alternatives, the kind of documentation that a serious collector or an auction house would want to examine before committing a significant number. Ronald didn't say anything about it directly. He noticed, and the noticing registered as information. Brian Thompson had already decided this was going to work. Not as a possibility. As a premise he was living inside. That kind of certainty from someone whose judgment Ronald trusted was not a small thing to carry alongside the calculations that kept threatening to become frightening. The Mustang was finished on a Thursday morning at the end of March. Not approximate finished. Not close enough finished. Done. Correct. The distinction mattered in the way all distinctions matter, when the person who will eventually write you a check for it has spent decades learning exactly what correct looks like, and can identify the gap between that and close enough in 45 seconds of looking at a body line from the right angle. The panels had been stripped to bare metal, properly treated, correctly primed, and resprayed in the factory original Highland green. Not a digital approximation, not the closest available modern equivalent, but the actual period-correct mixed formula sourced through a restoration paint specialist in Michigan who still worked from original manufacturer codes because his customer decided long ago, and the alternative wasn't actually his business, that the chrome trim had been re-chromed where replacement was necessary and carefully preserved where the original plating was recoverable. The interior had been retrimmed in correct black vinyl from a supplier in Kentucky who understood the difference between correct and close, and had built his entire operation on that understanding. The VIN matched the documentation. The build sheet had been researched, and the rebuild had honored it in every particular that could be honored. Brian pulled it out of the bay on a Saturday morning. The roll-up door repaired by both of them in late January, using a new motor that Brian had sourced from a commercial door supplier in Warren, an afternoon of work that had produced the specific satisfaction of a mechanical problem, solved correctly, opened smoothly. The Mustang rolled out into pale early spring light, still cold but differently cold than February. The kind of cold that is losing the argument with what comes after it. Brian sat behind the wheel. He turned the key. The engine turned twice, caught on the third rotation, and settled into an idle that was the specific sound of 40-year-old engineering doing exactly what it was designed to do. Not approximated. Not rebuilt to a reasonable facsimile of original performance. Rebuilt correctly, which produced a sound that was not available through any other means and could not be mistaken for anything adjacent to it. Ronald stood at the edge of the open bay with his arms crossed and listened to the idle for a full minute, not assessing it. He had already assessed it at every stage of the rebuild, and the assessment was complete. He was just listening to what the work had become, which was different from assessing it and required a different kind of attention. The attention you pay to something that has stopped being a project and started being a thing. Brian brought the revs up once, gently, with the respect you give something you have put serious work into and don't want to treat as a demonstration piece before it's been properly broken in. The exhaust note that moved through the cold morning air carried information that existed in no specification document. The information that something had been done right, which communicates itself in a frequency that people who have done things wrong can't always detect, and people who have done things right always can. Ronald said it looked good and went back inside to start on the Camaro. The listing went up on a Sunday afternoon. Private forum. Old school collector community, invitation only, the kind of space that predated social media and had remained in its original form, because the people who used it were not interested in the broader internet's approach to valuation, which tended to conflate enthusiasm with knowledge in ways that distorted prices in both directions. Verified members only. A listing without precise technical information was not taken seriously. A listing with it was read carefully by people with the knowledge and the means to respond. Ronald wrote the listing himself. 500 words. Accurate vehicle history. Restoration methodology with documentation available on request. 4 photographs exterior, engine bay, interior, VIN plate detail. Contact number. He set the phone down and did not look at it for 6 hours. When he picked it up, there were 11 unread messages. He read each one carefully. Most were qualified inquiries from people who knew what they were asking about. 2 were not. The enthusiasm to knowledge ratio was inverted in a way that indicated collector excitement running ahead of actual expertise, which was fine as a signal about the car's appeal and not useful as a transaction partner. The 11th message was different from its first word, not more enthusiastic, more specific. The questions it asked were: original build sheet documentation status, chrome restoration supplier identity, engine rebuild parts provenance, and whether the restoration log was available for review prior to a site visit. Those were not the questions of someone who wanted to own a Mustang. Those were the questions of someone who understood what correct restoration meant and was establishing whether it had actually been achieved or merely claimed. Ronald answered each question with the same level of precision they had been asked with. Same vocabulary. Same specificity. No hedging and no sales language. The response came back in under 2 hours. Donna Jackson, Nashville, Tennessee. Site visit requested at earliest convenience. Donna Jackson arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, 55 years old, dressed in the way of someone who had decided decades ago that quality and restraint were not competing values and had never revisited the question. Gray blazer, dark slacks, driving gloves she hadn't yet removed from the bag she'd brought from the airport. She had driven herself from the terminal in a rental, which Ronald noticed no assistant, no handler, no professional support structure. Just her, a notepad, and the kind of attention that didn't announce itself before it started working. She had built her collection over 12 years, beginning with a 1965 Shelby GT350 that had been her late husband Marcus's. She had kept it because she didn't want to understand secondhand what he had loved about it. She had educated herself. Then she had kept going. The collection now occupied a climate-controlled facility on her Tennessee property and was, by any honest accounting, one of the more serious private collections of American classic automobiles in the southeastern United States. She walked around the Mustang, once without speaking. Then she crouched at the front driver's quarter panel and looked at the body line through the paint from a low angle, checking for wave, the subtle surface distortion that indicates filler work even when the filler work has been done well. She was checking for something Ronald hadn't needed to conceal because it wasn't there. She opened the hood herself, then she produced a phone and made a call, and Edward Harris came in from the rental car outside. Edward was 63, retired from Chrysler's engineering division after 31 years, and had since made himself available selectively, on his own terms, to serious collectors who needed someone to tell them the truth about a vehicle before significant money changed hands. He wore a canvas flat cap and carried a borescope in a soft case. He nodded once when introduced to Ronald and went directly to the engine bay without further social investment, which Ronald understood as the behavior of a man who had learned that the work was the communication. Edward was under the car for an hour and 40 minutes. He used the borescope in the cylinders. He measured bearing clearances with gauges Ronald had laid out on the workbench in anticipation of this. He cross-referenced the build documentation against his own reference notebook, which appeared to contain specifications for most significant American performance vehicles produced between 1955 and 1975. Organized in a system only Edward fully understood, but that he navigated without hesitation. When he finished, he walked to Donna and spoke to her quietly. For approximately 90 seconds, Donna listened. Then she turned to Ronald. He says the restoration is as correct as anything he's seen outside of a professional museum program. She let it land. I'd like to offer $94,000. Ronald's expression did not change, not as performance. Because he had run the numbers on this car extensively across multiple sessions, and $94,000 was within the range he had calculated for a correct restoration of this specific vehicle in the current market, and he had already decided before she arrived what number he would accept. That works, he said. Donna nodded once. She put on her driving gloves and picked up her bag. Then she stopped. I have people in my circle who spend real time looking for this quality of work. Not cars I find for them, the work itself. Simply stated without elaboration. If you come across anything worth their attention, I'd appreciate a call before it goes anywhere public. Ronald said he appreciated that and meant it. What he didn't say, there were 6 more vehicles in the building she was standing 30 feet from, and at least 2 of them she would likely want herself. The wire transfer cleared 72 hours later. Brian saw the notification on Ronald's phone. The phone was on the workbench between them and Brian had the better angle and grabbed Ronald's shoulder with both hands. Ronald allowed approximately 2 seconds of this. Then he stepped back, put the phone in his pocket, picked up the tool he'd set down to wait for the confirmation, and went back to work on the Camaro. Brian looked at him for a moment. Then Brian started laughing. The full version. The one that had filled every break room at Vantage and was now filling a garage on the east side of Detroit on a Tuesday morning in April. And it filled it the same way, completely, without apology, taking up exactly as much space as it needed to. Ronald kept working and let him laugh. He moved on the land the next morning. Both vacant lots immediately behind the garage property had been on Ronald's radar since the first week of February. He had identified the owners through property records, assessed the asking prices against the current market and against the Phase 2 zone information Timothy Clark had provided, and determined that both lots were priced to reflect their present appearance rather than their future value. The gap between those 2 numbers was the same gap that existed in the planning documents and nowhere else, which meant the window for acting on it was finite and not announced in advance. He contacted both owners directly. No broker, no listing agent. Simple private sale letters, factual, clear, with a number that was fair relative to current market conditions, and not fair relative to the market conditions that would exist in 12 to 18 months, which was the relevant comparison, and one that neither owner was positioned to make because neither had access to the zone classification information that Timothy Clark had described in a phone call 7 months earlier. Both owners responded within a week. Both sold. Total acquisition cost $67,000, which left Ronald with approximately $26,000 after the land purchase, generated entirely from the Mustang sale, from the Bel Air finished and sold privately through Donna's network for $28,500 while Ronald was still in the land negotiation, and from the impound yard work that had been running in the background continuously since October. He filed the deeds on a Thursday, started the business registration paperwork the same day. On the following Tuesday, he took the 3rd vacant lot on a purchase option. 60-day conversion window, $8,500 down, predetermined strike price. The owner was a woman in her 70s who had been trying to move the property for 4 years and who regarded the option structure as an unnecessarily complicated way to buy a piece of concrete and chain link, which it was, and which Ronald was entirely comfortable with, Sanchez Restoration and Auto Works. That was the name on the registration documents. He had written 3 alternatives and crossed them out. This one said what the operation was, and whose it was, and that was the necessary minimum. He hired Gary Young the following week. Gary came with a reference from a restoration house in Pennsylvania that Ronald called before the hire conversation. The reference described Gary as a body specialist who worked slowly by some standards and correctly by all of them, which was the right trade-off in Ronald's operation because the standard he was working to did not have a faster option. Gary was 38, precise, and had the specific professional demeanor of someone who had made a significant mistake once in his career, full story, and had responded to it by becoming methodical in a way that most people would describe as excessive, and that Ronald would describe as correct. George White was different, 50 years in the industry, if you counted the years at his grandfather's wrecking yard in Alabama, where George had grown up sorting parts at ages that current labor law would find irregular. He knew where things were not in the general sense, but with a specificity that operated through a network of private dealers, estate sale contacts, barn find specialists, and retired restorers existed almost entirely outside the internet because the people who held the best inventory had found the internet too crowded with buyers who didn't know what they were buying. George communicated through a flip phone, a fax machine, and a spiral address book with so many crossed-out entries that the pages were visibly thicker at the margins. He sourced two critical components for the Camaro through contacts that Ronald, searching through conventional channels, would not have found in 6 months. Ronald retained him on a per-project basis, with a right of first refusal on sourcing for all active jobs. George said that was fine and wrote the terms in the address book with a pen, physically, in ink. Brian Thompson became, without ceremony or formal announcement, the technical director of the operation. This was not a title Ronald invented for him. It was as a description of what Brian had already become, through the accumulation of the work he ran the beige schedule, managed condition assessments for incoming projects, made the final call on restoration approach when the options had meaningful trade-offs. Ronald trusted this. Not uncritically, they disagreed, and the disagreements were useful because disagreements between two people who know what they're talking about produce better outcomes than agreement between them. But the trust was foundational. The Pantera consumed 6 weeks, from the first day of active work delayed until the Camaro was sufficiently advanced that the bay could be reorganized to accommodate the mid-engine layout, to the day it was complete. 6 weeks. Approximately twice what Ronald's original timeline had allocated, which was the kind of information you received from a job like this and incorporated into the next estimate without complaint. The engine was the first problem. The Cleveland V8 had been sitting unmoved for longer than any other car in the inventory. The others showed signs of deliberate long-term storage preparation, drained fluids, certain components treated before sealing the evidence of someone who had known they were putting these cars away for an extended period and had done what they could to minimize the damage of time. The Pantera's engine had been sealed but not chemically prepared for dormancy, and the piston rings had adhered to the cylinder walls over the decades in a way that made the engine not just non-operational, but actively dangerous to turn over without first addressing the adhesion. The process Ronald used was Thomas Rodriguez's. Written in the old notebook in the shorthand Thomas had developed across 30 years of dealing with engines that had given up on themselves. A specific sequence of penetrating solvent applications, in the correct order with the correct intervals, at temperatures that required keeping the garage heated to 65 degrees continuously for 11 days. A cost Ronald tracked carefully in the operating ledger, and one chemical substitution based on a product that hadn't existed when Thomas wrote the original entry. On the 12th day, with Brian positioned at the breaker bar and Ronald at the engine stand monitoring for resistance, the engine turned freely. Brian stood next to Ronald for a moment after confirming movement and said nothing. Then, "Your father wrote that down 30 years ago." Ronald set the monitoring tool down. "Yeah, that's a thing," Brian said. Ronald picked up the next tool. "It is. The bodywork required 3 weeks of Gary Young operating at a level Ronald watched with the attention you pay to someone performing above their ordinary ceiling. The Pantera's Italian coachwork had surface corrosion at the door sills and the rear valance that required actual fabrication rather than filler cutting, and replacing rather than building up and finishing over, because the restoration standard Ronald was working to did not have a filler option, and everyone in the building understood this without it needing to be stated. George White sourced the body panels through a contact in Atlanta, a retired restorer who had acquired a small inventory of De Tomaso panels in the early 1990s and had been holding them in a climate-controlled barn since, waiting for the right buyer at the right moment. The contact arrived via fax on a Tuesday afternoon. George called Ronald to confirm availability and pricing, and the question of whether expedited shipping was an acceptable additional cost. to which Ronald said yes without hesitation, because the alternative was losing the panels to someone else who didn't need to ask. The interior material came from two sources George had already identified before Ronald asked. Correct specification vinyl from a supplier in New Jersey. Period correct carpet from a specialty automotive textile company whose U.S. representative George had cultivated over 15 years, and who accepted orders on terms that required some patience and some financial commitment in advance. The electrical system was, as Brian described it across multiple days with increasing vocabulary, a document of Italian engineering philosophy that had prioritized elegance of routing over accessibility, for service in a way that made future maintenance a deliberate challenge rather than an incidental one. Brian spent 4 days mapping it before touching a single connection, building a wiring diagram on paper taped to the north wall that eventually measured 6 feet by 4 feet. When the work was done and the diagram came down, Brian rolled it carefully and set it aside. Ronald asked why he was keeping it. "Because I never want to do this again," Brian said. "And if I ever have to, I want a head start." When the Pantera was finished, they brought it out of the bay on a Thursday evening. The space around the car was clear. The overhead lighting correct color rendering now. The fixtures Brian had replaced in February was the right light for what they were looking at. The paint was red. The factory color for this car in this year, mixed from the original pigment code through a specialist George had identified, and that had required 2 weeks of correspondence, a color sample card, and a second specialist to verify the mix before application. Under correct lighting, the paint did what only correctly formulated. Period-specific paint does it absorbed and returned light in a way that gave the color depth rather than surface, the difference between a color that sits on top of a thing and a color that lives inside it. Gary Young stood back after the final inspection pass, folded his arms, and was quiet for a moment. "That's the best paint work I've ever done." Brian looked at the car for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Ronald. "Are you going to tell me what we're going to do with it?" Ronald looked at the car, at the shape of it in the bay, the specific geometry of the wedge body, the proportions that communicated capability without explaining themselves. "Barrett Jackson," he said. "Special consignment. June." Brian absorbed this, the auction, the room, the audience. The specific kind of number a car like this could produce when the room understood what it was looking at. He looked back at the Pantera. "Yeah," Brian said. "Okay." Then Donna Jackson called. She called on a Friday evening, 3 days after Ronald had submitted the Barrett Jackson consignment application. She had, she said, mentioned Ronald's work to several people in her network after the Mustang transaction. She had passed his contact information to 3 people, not the 2 she'd mentioned when she left the lot in April. The third person was Jonathan Wright, 51 years old, Detroit area collector, specific focus on Italian-American vehicles from the 1960s and 1970s. He was on the advisory committee for the Barrett-Jackson regional events. He was familiar with the consignment submission. "I think you're going to have the right audience," Donna said, simply without inflation. Ronald thanked her and ended the call and stood in the garage for a moment. The Pantera sat in the bay under the correct lights, 40 years under a blue tarp, in a building assessed at negative $15,000. Sold as part of a package for $1,000 by a woman who had looked at the building and made a call based on everything visible. Ronald had made a different call based on what he believed was underneath. Now he was going to find out what the difference between those 2 calls was actually worth. He went back to the documentation. There was still a significant amount left to write, and he wanted it complete before the carrier arrived. Set. Stephanie Harris called on a Monday morning in early June. Ronald was at the workbench reviewing the Camaro's final inspection checklist. 1. The Camaro had been sold in May through Donna's network for a number that Ronald had written in the spiral notebook, and then looked at for a moment before moving on, because looking at it for too long felt like the wrong use of the energy the moment deserved. He didn't recognize the number. he answered. She identified herself. Northeast Business Review. 9 years on the business and finance beat. She had heard about Sanchez's restoration through a contact in the collector community and was interested in a conversation. Ronald said, politely, that he was not interested in being interviewed. She called back the following morning. He didn't answer. She emailed the garage's contact address that afternoon. 2 paragraphs. The first said she was not interested in writing a success story. The second said the story she was interested in was the specific moment when someone sees something that everyone around them has dismissed and decides to act on what they see rather than on what they are told to see. Ronald read it 3 times. He thought about it for a day. Then he replied. 30 minutes in person, the garage. She arrived on a Wednesday, exactly on time, not early, not late. On time in the specific way that indicated professional respect for other people's schedules, which Ronald associated with people who were serious enough about their own work to understand that other people's time was equally real. They talked for 2.5 hours. She asked about the tarps. She asked about the crankshaft from Ohio and the electrical diagram that had covered the north wall, and the night the roof section failed at 2 in the morning. She asked about Thomas Rodriguez and the notebook in Ronald's jacket pocket and the sentence written in Thomas's handwriting that Ronald had read perhaps 100 times across his life. She asked who had sold him the building. Ronald said it had been Cross Capital Group. He said Sandra Anderson had signed the contract personally. He said it without heat or emphasis, just as a fact because it was a fact, and facts stated accurately, in a level voice, carried their own weight without needing anything added to them. Stephanie wrote it down. Then she underlined it. Ronald watched her do it and said nothing. He thought about that underline for a while after she left, not with anxiety. With the specific attention of someone who understands that a thing is about to enter a larger space and that once it's there, some of its shape will belong to someone else. He had said what was true. He had said it accurately. The rest was the work of journalism, which was not his work, and which he had decided to trust, because Stephanie Harris had asked questions that indicated she understood the difference between a story and a story that was actually about something. He went back to the Pantera documentation. There was still work left to write, and he wanted it right before the event. Stephanie's article ran on a Tuesday, 4 days before the Barrett-Jackson event. Ronald found out it was live from Donna Jackson, who texted him a link at 6:47 in the morning with no accompanying message. Just the link, which was its own kind of communication. Donna was not a person who sent links without reason, and not a person who sent anything before 7 in the morning, unless it required immediate attention from the recipient. He read it at the workbench with his coffee going cold beside him. Stephanie had written it the way she'd said she would. Not a success story, a story about a specific kind of seeing, and what happens when it encounters a world organized around a different kind of knowing. She described the garage as it had been in February: the cold, the signed contract, the tarps, the 12 minutes Ronald had spent inside before making his offer. She described Ronald's background without sentimentality. The engineering degree, the 7 years at Vantage, the layoff notification at 11:17 on a Friday night, the 8 months of impound work that followed. She described what was under the tarps in enough technical detail that the people who knew what they were reading would understand what they were reading, and in enough human detail that the people who didn't would understand what it meant. And near the end, in a paragraph Ronald read twice, she named Cross Capital Group. She named Sandra Anderson. She quoted the $1 zero-zone figure and the negative $15,000 assessment, and the relocation clause with its 18-month window. She quoted the phrase "very optimistic man," attributed accurately as a characterization Sandra had offered at the time of signing, in the specific tone of someone who had already decided the transaction was trivial. She had not invented anything. She had written what happened, accurately, in the neutral register of a journalist who understood that facts arranged correctly did not require decoration to carry weight. Ronald set his phone down, looked at the workbench. At the tools lined up in the order he'd placed them the night before, the order that indicated the morning's planned work, before the article had entered the day and rearranged everything around it. At the Pantera documentation folder in the corner, 3 inches thick, completed last night at 11:30 after the final review pass. He picked up the phone and read the article a third time, then he called Carol. Olivia was already at school. Carol had the morning routine locked in with the efficiency of someone who had been getting children out the door on time for 40 years, but he called Carol's cell because he knew she'd have it, and because there were certain mornings when you needed to talk to someone who had known you since, before you knew yourself. Carol picked up on the second ring. He could hear the background sounds of her kitchen, the specific acoustic signature of a house that was occupied and warm. "You're going to have a busy couple of days," she said. "Not a question. Yeah, you ready?" Ronald thought about the documentation folder in the corner. The 6 months. The cot against the south wall in February. The night the roof came in at 2 in the morning. The notebook in his jacket pocket with Thomas's handwriting and his own entry below it. "I've been ready since February," he said. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father would be insufferable right now. He would not stop talking about it for a week." Her voice held the specific mixture of grief and warmth that only time produces, the two things so thoroughly combined by now that you couldn't separate them even if you wanted to, and she didn't want to. "I mean that as a compliment." Ronald said he knew. He said he'd call after the event. He ended the call and looked at the Pantera. The car sat in the bay under the correct overhead lights, already staged for the carrier's arrival at 10. The transport was insured. The documentation had been submitted to Barrett Jackson in April. The consignment paperwork was complete in every particular. There was nothing left to prepare, which was its own strange feeling, the specific disorientation of finishing, of arriving at the place where the work is done, and what comes next is not more work, but the result of the work, which requires a completely different kind of readiness that no amount of preparation entirely provides. Brian arrived at 7:15, 2 coffees. Box of donuts from the place on Mac. The expression of a man who had read the article and was processing approximately 7 simultaneous emotions and had made a practical decision about all of them. He set everything on the workbench. Looked at the Pantera, looked at Ronald. 11,000 views, Brian said. As of 6 a.m. That's what Dwight texted me. 11,000 people read the article. 11,000 views. Which is not exactly the same thing, but close enough. Also, Dwight says someone shared it on 3 collector forums overnight, and it's moving. Ronald picked up his coffee. "We need to leave for the venue by noon." Brian looked at him for a moment. "That's your response? The car needs to be there by 2 for staging." Ronald, Brian picked up a donut, bit into it with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that food is the appropriate container for the feelings that don't have better containers right now. Chewed. Swallowed. "I just want to say, for the record, that I showed up at a cold garage in February with no salary and no contract, and I stayed. I think that should be formally acknowledged." Ronald looked at him. 20%. Brian pointed the donut. "That's right. 20%. Another bite. "Okay, noon. I'll have the truck ready." The Stephanie Harris article had done something Ronald hadn't fully modeled in advance. It had made the car mean something before anyone in the room had seen it. That was the mechanism he hadn't accounted for. He had planned the auction in terms of the object, the Pantera's rarity, the restoration quality, the documentation, the provenance. He had thought about the room in terms of qualified buyers, with the knowledge and capital to act. He had not fully calculated the narrative layer that Stephanie's piece added, the specific quality of attention that arrives when a story about an object precedes the object's appearance and gives the audience something to feel before they have something to evaluate. By Thursday evening, his phone had received 42 calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Brian had fielded another 30 on the business line. 3 were journalists wanting follow-up. 8 were collectors who had read the article and wanted to discuss other vehicles in the inventory. 11 were people who wanted restoration work and had nothing specific to bring, yet they just wanted to be known to the operation, to have established contact before the waitlist formed. The remaining 20 were various categories of the world responding to a story about someone who had done something real in a context where real things were increasingly uncommon. Ronald returned 2 calls before Saturday, both from active prospects for remaining inventory, both conversations kept under 10 minutes, and let the rest go to voicemail he would address after the event, because Saturday was the thing everything else was organized around, and treating it as one item among many would be the wrong relationship to have with it in the days immediately before it. He slept in his actual apartment, Thursday and Friday nights for the first time in a week. He needed to arrive at the event in a state that resembled a functioning person, rather than the accumulated residue of someone who had been running on determination and impound-yard cash for 6 months, and that required 2 nights of treating the outcome as something he had already earned rather than something still in question. He laid out the suit on Friday night. Black, single-breasted. The one from Thomas's funeral 5 years ago, which still fit because grief has a way of arriving at moments when eating becomes less instinctive, and the weight lost in those months doesn't fully return. He checked the jacket, pressed the trousers, polished the shoes, which took longer than expected because the leather had dried out from years in the back of the closet behind things he used more often. He put Thomas's notebook in the inside jacket pocket, not the spiral one with the vehicle records, the old one, the one that had traveled in his jacket since the funeral and had been in his pocket through every morning of the past 6 months, through the February cold and the milk crate and the crankshaft weight and the night the roof failed and the 11-day chemical process and every calculation that had threatened to become frightening. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment, a man in a suit with a notebook in his jacket pocket that smelled faintly like his father's shop on Davison. He went to bed. The conference center on Saturday evening was the kind of space designed to contain significant money comfortably. High ceilings, indirect lighting, the acoustic treatment that makes a room of several hundred people sound like fewer and feel more intimate than the square footage suggested. The Barrett-Jackson team had been running events here for 3 years and had the room configured with the geometry that made bidding feel simultaneously observed and personal. Every seat had a clear sightline to the presentation floor. The floor was lit with adjustable fixtures tuned to each vehicle as it came through. Ronald arrived at 5:15 for a 6 o'clock start. He stood in the staging area after the Pantera had been moved to its pre-presentation position. The car sat under the working lights, not the full presentation rig yet, just the staging lights the floor crew used, and even under working lights the red paint did what the red paint did. He touched the roofline once lightly, with 2 fingers. Not checking anything. The checking was done. Just making contact with the thing he had spent 6 months building toward, the way you make contact with something before you release it into a context larger than yourself. Then, he went to find his seat. Brian was already there. 2nd row, right side, aisle seat. Because Brian at 6'2" could not in good conscience put his legs anywhere else, and had arrived early enough to exercise the option. He was wearing a dark blue blazer over a shirt that was the most formal version of Brian Thompson currently available, which meant it had a collar and was not a work shirt, and he had clearly put real effort into it. He had left the donut situation at home, which represented a level of occasion recognition that Ronald acknowledged internally. Brian looked at Ronald's suit. Then at Ronald's face. "You look like a man who has done the math," Brian said. "I've done the math," and Ronald sat down. "The math is good." Donna Jackson arrived at 5:40, coming through the main entrance with 2 people from her network whose names Ronald recognized from her descriptions over the previous months. She found his row across the floor and caught his eye. She raised her chin 1/2 inch. That was Donna's wave. He returned it with a slight nod, which was the appropriate response in the register they operated in. Jonathan Wright arrived at 5:50 and went directly to his seat in the 5th row without looking for anyone to greet. He had a notebook on his knee within 60 seconds of sitting down and spent the first 10 minutes writing in it, the behavior of someone who has already decided what they are going to do and is organizing the execution rather than still deliberating about it. Ronald noted this. It was useful information about the room's temperature. Before the bidding started, the event director did a sound check at 5:55, and then Sandra Anderson walked in. Ronald saw her before she saw him. She came through the side entrance, the one closer to the back of the room, away from the main flow of arriving guests, and she was alone. No Angela Young with a clipboard, no attorney, no structural engineer, no professional infrastructure of any kind. Just Sandra Anderson in a charcoal coat that was different from the caramel one she'd worn in February, standing in a large room she had apparently not expected to feel the way it felt. She looked around, taking inventory of the space, the scale of it, the quality of the room's attention, which was already focused forward even before the event had officially begun. And then she looked at the staging floor and saw the Pantera. Ronald watched her see it. She stood still for approximately 4 seconds after her eyes found the car. 4 seconds was not a long time in most contexts. In the context of Sandra Anderson, who processed information quickly, who moved from assessment to conclusion, without apparent hesitation, who had built a professional identity on the premise that her read of a situation was accurate and final. 4 seconds of complete stillness in response to a single object was a duration that meant something. Then she found a position near the back wall and stayed there. Standing rather than seated, watching rather than participating, Ronald turned back to the front of the room. His jaw was set. Not from anger. From the same physical discipline that had kept his hands steady on the February morning he'd pulled back the first tarp, the specific bodily response of someone who has been carrying something for 6 months and is finally standing at the place where it didn't. The carrying either meant something, or it, and where that question is about to be answered in the clearest available language. Brian leaned over. She's here, I saw her, back left, standing near the I know where she is, Brian. Brian sat back. A moment passed, then at a volume that required Ronald to lean slightly. You going to be okay? Ronald kept his eyes forward. At the staging floor. At the car that had been under a blue tarp in a building, assessed at negative $15,000 until the morning he pulled the tarp back. With a flashlight and a spiral notebook, some specific education of a man who had spent 30 years alone learning to see what other people had decided was already classified. Yeah, he said. Besides, I'm going to be fine. The evening opened with 9 vehicles before the Pantera. Ronald watched all 9 with the dual attention of someone tracking both the cars and the room, how the bidding opened, where the energy originated, where the energy, which audience members were active across multiple lots, and which had come for one specific thing, and were conserving themselves until it arrived. He was reading the room's temperature, its appetite, the quality of its knowledge, which varied across the audience but ran deep enough in sufficient pockets to constitute a serious room. The 6th lot produced a bidding sequence that went 11 rounds and ended with applause that was genuinely warm, a 1966 Corvette in correct restoration, with strong documentation, the kind of car that generated appreciation from people who understood what correct meant and recognized it when they saw it. Ronald noted this. The applause at the resolution of a strong lot was information. It told you what the room valued and how openly it was willing to express that. The 7th lot went fast. 4 bids resolved efficiently. A buyer who had arrived with a specific number and the intention to reach it without extended theater. The 8th lot, a Shelby variant, correct but not at the level of the Mustang Ronald, had sold Donna-produced bidding that reflected the market accurately. The room was pricing things well tonight. It was not inflating and it was not discounting. It was applying knowledge correctly, which was the best possible environment for a car that deserved a correct number. Between the 8th and 9th lots, Ronald looked across the room. Sandra Anderson was still at the back wall. She had not moved in 40 minutes. Her arms were at her sides rather than crossed, which in someone with her professional carriage indicated either genuine composure or a very specific kind of exhaustion. And from this distance, he could not determine which. He looked back at the staging floor. The 9th lot resolved, and the room acknowledged it. And then the lights shifted. The presentation floor dimmed at the perimeter and brightened at the center, and the curtain at the rear parted, and the Pantera came through at the measured pace. The floor crew used 6 miles per hour, the speed at which something arrives when it has waited long enough. That arriving quickly would be the wrong tone. The sound that moved through the room was not applause. Not yet. It was the collective intake of breath that happens when something genuinely beautiful enters a space. And the room hasn't processed it quickly enough to respond with the conventional social gesture. A communal pause. The suspension that lives in the gap between perception and reaction, which is the most honest moment available in any audience because it hasn't been mediated yet by the awareness of being watched. Then someone in the 4th row started clapping, and the room followed. The auctioneer let it run for a moment before taking the microphone. He had the specific, professional skill of his function, the ability to hold a room's energy at its current temperature without either spending it or allowing it to cool. He introduced the vehicle with the economy of someone who understood that the car was doing most of the work, and his job was to provide the necessary context without getting between the room and what it was looking at. Vehicle history, production numbers. The partnership between the Italian coach builder and Ford's engine division. Total production across all years worldwide. The restoration provenance documenting methodology, sourcing, the 11-day chemical process required to free the seized engine, the panel fabrication, the period-correct paint mixed from the original manufacturer code. He named Ronald Sanchez and Sanchez Restoration and Auto Works as the restoring firm. The section of the room that had read Stephanie's article, and there were more of them than Ronald had estimated, the 11,000 views had translated into meaningful room penetration, responded with a round of applause that was warmer and more sustained than standard lot acknowledgement. It was the applause of people who had come knowing the story, and were now seeing the object, and finding that the object was worth the story, which was not always the case, and was therefore worth acknowledging when it was. Ronald sat completely still. Beside him, Brian was gripping the aisle armrest with one hand, and a folded event program with the other, and the program was not going to survive the evening in any usable form. The auctioneer opened bidding, starting at $80,000. Do I have 80? A paddle from the left side of the room, 3rd row. Immediate. The movement of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was establishing their presence in it. 80,000. Do I have 90? Phone bank. One of the 8 lines Barrett Jackson had active for this event, managed by staff positioned along the right wall with headsets and bidding authorization from buyers who were in other cities or other time zones or who simply preferred to participate at a remove. 90 on the phone. Looking for 100 on the floor, the left side floor bidder came back. The room's attention had locked in now the specific quality of silence in a space of several hundred people when the number is real and the object is rare. And the audience understands both things simultaneously without needing to verify either. 100, 110, 120. The floor bidder and the first phone line trading in clean increments with the rhythm of 2 parties who both had room to go and were measuring each other. Rather than approaching their ceiling, 130. A pause at 130 that lasted 4 seconds, long enough to feel like uncertainty, but not long enough to be it. Second phone line, 135. First phone line, 140. The floor bidder, 145. Brian's program was now in 2 structural pieces and he had stopped noticing. 150, 155, 160. Jonathan Wright raised his paddle in the 5th row. Clean, decisive, without the preliminary hesitation of someone still deciding. He had been deciding since April, when Donna Jackson had described the car to him, and since February when he had read about the building, and since whatever point his specific knowledge developed the stefik required to understand what a correctly restored 1971 Tommaso Pantera in this condition was worth in this room tonight. 1 Mortu. Safinish 165. Pawn line 1 responded within seconds. 170. Jonathan Wright again. The same economy of movement, the same absence of theater. 175. The room went to the specific stillness that only occurs when the number has stopped being theoretical. When everyone present understands that what is happening in front of them is real and final, and will be exactly what it is in the next 30 seconds, regardless of what anyone in the room thinks or feels or wishes about it. Phone line 1, 178. The auctioneer's voice moved through the room with the precision of someone timing a moment that cannot be extended without losing it. $178,000 on the phone. Looking for 180 on the floor. Jonathan Wright looked at his notebook for exactly 2 seconds. Then he set the paddle down on his knee. The auctioneer moved through the cadence with the respect the moment required. 178, going once. The room didn't move. 178, going twice. Still, the gavel came up and came down. The sound it made was not physically large. Gavels never are. But the sound it made in Ronald Sanchez's chest was something different from the physics of a wooden implement striking a wooden surface. This one moved through him in a way he had not fully prepared for, even though he had been preparing for 6 months. Because there are things that preparation can approximate, and things that only the moment itself can produce, and this was both. Brian Thompson exhaled so loudly and so completely that the man directly in front of him turned around in his seat. Ronald did not move for a moment. Then the floor representative was at his row with his hand extended. And Ronald stood and shook it and accepted the congratulations of the people immediately around him. Some he knew, some he didn't, all of them responding to something that had just happened in the room and that required acknowledgement even from people. At the periphery of it. He was composed in the specific way of someone who has done the arithmetic correctly and is watching the arithmetic confirm itself rather than discovering something new. Not surprised, not overwhelmed. Confirmed. Which is different from both of those things and requires a different kind of response. Response quieter, more interior. The response of someone receiving information they already had and are now watching the world agree with. Not surprised. Just confirmed. And that confirmation, arriving in a room full of people who understood what they had just witnessed, was sufficient. He found a quiet corner in the lobby 20 minutes later and called Carol. He'd slipped out during the 10th lot, which required no attention from him, and Carol had apparently been watching for the Barrett Jackson. Result, through some channel. Ronald hadn't known she was monitoring, because she called before he had fully cleared the side door. He answered immediately. Before he could say anything, he heard Olivia in the background, the specific frequency of a 7-year-old who has identified an important moment and intends to be present for it. Is that Daddy? Let me talk to him. Banoy, let me. And then a brief physical negotiation for possession of the phone, and then Olivia's voice, slightly breathless from the effort of the negotiation. Did it work? Ronald leaned against the lobby wall. $7 in January, 7. Not 700, not 7,000. $7 in a school parking lot, and 63 seconds of counting, while deciding what the word yes was actually constructed of, and whether he had built enough of the right material to say it honestly. It worked, baby. How much? Pure Olivia, the 7-year-old who had stood in the garage in April and wanted to know specifically what things were worth, who had absorbed her father's empiricism as naturally as she had absorbed Carol's eyes and Thomas's habit of knowing before knowing. A lot, he said. How much is a lot? More than we need. A pause. He could hear her processing. Is that more than the red car was supposed to cost? Much more. Another pause, longer. The pause of someone arriving at a number large enough that it requires a moment to hold. Then, Benoit is crying. Ronald looked up at the lobby ceiling for a moment and breathed. Tell her it's okay. She knows it's okay. She's crying because she's happy. That's different crying, I know. Are you crying? Ronald considered this honestly. Not yet. Okay, Olivia said, satisfied with the accounting. Then, Beau? Yeah, I told everyone at school my dad was fixing old cars in a garage. They thought that was weird. What did you tell them? The shrug was audible. The particular sound of a 7-year-old deploying a thing they have decided is sufficient and requires no elaboration. I told them my dad knows what things are worth when other people don't. Ronald closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about Thomas Rodriguez on Davison, the shop rag, the specific patience of a man who had learned that the engine would tell you what it needed if you were quiet enough to hear it, and who had passed that knowledge to his son, not through instruction, but through 30 years of Saturday mornings spent in a one-bay garage. Doing the thing the right way because the right way was the only way he knew. He thought about the $20,200 in late February, the 2 tow jobs at 3 in the morning that he hadn't told Brian about, the milk crate in the dark garage with the flashlight and the spiral notebook and the number range written in pencil because pencil felt more provisional. And provisional felt more honest when you were working from belief rather than proof. He thought about a specific kind of faith, not the religious kind, the operational kind. The kind that says, I have done the calculation, I have assessed the evidence as carefully as I know how to assess evidence. I believe the number, and I am going to behave as if the number is correct until the world confirms or corrects me. The world had just confirmed it, in a room full of people who understood what they were looking at, which was, in its way, the most complete confirmation available. Yeah, he said. Something like that. He told Olivia he'd be home late, that he loved her, that she should try to sleep at a reasonable hour, which was a thing he said, and she heard, and both of them understood to be aspirational rather than directive. Then he ended the call and stood in the lobby for a moment with the phone in his hand, and the sound of the room behind the doors and the specific quiet of a lobby after something significant has happened in the space adjacent to it. Then he went back in. Sandra Anderson was still at the back wall when he returned. She had stayed through the Pantera lot. She had watched the bidding move from $80,000 to $178,000 in approximately 9 minutes of real time, and she had watched the gavel come down. And she had stayed through the following lot. And she was still there, in the same position when Ronald came back through the side door. He could see her from across the room. He could see that she had watched him come back in, that she had made a decision about something in the interval since the gavel. She pushed off the wall and began crossing the room toward him. It was a long walk. The room was large, and she was coming from the back and he was near the front. And the length of the walk gave Ronald enough time to watch her cover the distance and to understand what the walk was costing her, not money. Something more expensive than money, the specific currency of a person who has built their professional identity on the accuracy of their assessments, having to cross a room towards someone whose existence disproves that identity's most fundamental claim. Stephanie Harris was on the right side of the room with her notebook open. She saw Sandra moving across the floor. She didn't intercept or redirect. She simply watched, in the way that good journalists watch when they understand that the event is arranging itself without assistance, and that assistance would only diminish it. Sandra stopped in front of Ronald, close enough that the conversation stayed between them. She was without the architecture of her professional life, no Angela, no attorney, no clipboard, no structural engineer, no infrastructure of any kind between her and the transaction that had been completed at a folding table in February, and that had just produced a specific number in a specific room and could not be undone or reframed or reclassified. She had the look of someone who has been conducting an internal argument for 4 months and has just conceded it. I misjudged the situation. Her voice was level, not apologetic exactly. Sandra Anderson's register didn't have a comfortable home in apology. which was something you could tell from 4 minutes in her professional presence, but something precise and undecorated. The statement of someone who has decided that the accurate thing is also the necessary thing, stated without the softening language that would have made it easier to deliver and less meaningful to receive. She didn't add to it. No framework, no distribution of responsibility, no conversion of the error into something more manageable than what it actually was. Ronald looked at her. The list of things he could say was fully available to him. The moment offered all of them. February was right there, the cold, Angela's laugh, the key going into his jacket pocket, the sound of Sandra's voice saying "very optimistic man" as she walked toward the SUV. He could access any of it. The situation technically extended the invitation. He didn't reach for any of it. "You saw the building," he said. "You made a call based on what was visible. I made a different call based on what I thought was underneath. A pause not theatrical. Just the pause of finding the exact word rather than the approximate one. We looked at the same thing with different equipment." Sandra held his eyes for a moment, processing this response, which was not the response she had prepared for. The specific recalibration of someone who had rehearsed for retaliation and received, instead, a kind of clarity that was harder to absorb than retaliation, because it didn't provide the resistance you had organized yourself to meet. Then Ronald extended his hand. She looked at it for 1 full second. Then she shook it, brief and complete, the kind of handshake that doesn't need to be extended to mean what it means. She released first, turned and walked toward the side exit without looking back. No performance in the departure, no statement being made through the manner of it. Just a woman who had come to see something, had seen it, and was leaving. Stephanie Harris closed her notebook. She looked at Ronald across the room. He gave her a single nod. She returned it. That was the entirety of what needed to be communicated between two people who had already said what needed saying. Brian at Ronald's elbow approximately 4 seconds after Sandra disappeared through the side door. "Was that yeah? What did she?" "She said she misjudged it." Brian absorbed this. A moment. "That's it. That's it. What did you say?" Ronald looked toward the staging floor, where the 11th lot was beginning its presentation under the adjusted lights. I said. We looked at the same thing with different equipment. Brian was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, "That's good. That's actually really good. A beat. I would not have said that. I know. I would have said something else entirely. I know, Brian. Something considerably less, Brian." "Right." Brian looked at the presentation floor. "Camaro documentation is complete. You want to talk about the next project?" "Yeah," Ronald said. "Let's talk about the next project."